Our second speaker is Molly Nolan, who's a professor of history emerita at NYU, a member of Historians for Peace and Democracy, and one of I'd say the key architect of this sanctions syllabus.
I want to address two key hotly debated questions about sanctions. Are they legal and are they effective? The question of legality can be answered differently depending on whether one is talking about how US sanctions or UN and EU sanctions, which the US has joined. It also depends on whether one is talking about the general or comprehensive sanctions imposed on a country or targeted sanctions against individuals, entities, or particular commodities, or whether one is talking about secondary sanctions against third countries which refuse to follow the dictates of US unilaterally imposed sanctions. According to US law, the government, or rather the president, can impose sanctions. This was originally done under the World War I Trading with the Enemy Act that was then carried over into peacetime. Since 1977, presidents could impose sanctions under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. Like the War Powers Act of 1973, the Economic Emergency Powers Act was supposed to limit presidential power, but the Supreme Court quickly eroded any such congressional oversight. The president now need only to declare an economic emergency and he can impose any sanctions he wishes or is encouraged to by others. There is no requirement that he get subsequent congressional approval or even report to Congress on the extent and effectiveness of any sanctions. And there are no time limits on the sanctions imposed. International law seems to be trickier, and I'm not an international lawyer, but from the reading I have done, multilateral sanctions imposed by the UN are uniformly considered legal. The EU insists on its right to sanction, and those are obviously, given the nature of the EU, multilateral, and almost all EU sanctions are supported by the UN as well. Some international lawyers consider unilateral US sanctions illegal, regardless of whether they're general or targeted. They're seen as coercive and unilateral violations of national sovereignty and as acts of aggression. Secondary sanctions, punishing a third-party government or business that refuses to adhere to a US sanctions regime, does not seem to have a basis in international law, but the US can create compliance with such unilateral sanctions because of the power of its economy, the size of its markets, and the centrality of the dollar as a key global currency. What about effectiveness? The first thing one needs to ask is, what is it that sanctions are intended to do? In the case of the US, which, as Nick indicated, is the main sanctioning state at the moment, sanctions serve as a key tool in foreign policy along with diplomacy and military intervention. But to what ends? Many insist the goal is to change the policies of a particular regime, and policies range from weapons development to human rights violations, from unfair economic competition to threatening military action against third countries. Regime change is often another goal, although that is one which is much less explicitly acknowledged. Proponents of sanctions disagree on whether sanctions are an alternative to the use of force or a step towards so doing it if sanctions don't achieve the desired end. Critics argue that sanctions in and of themselves are a form of war, and one particularly brutal to civilians. Sanctions, by and large, have not brought about either regime change or significant changes in policies. Take general sanctions, the sort of comprehensive ones. They have been imposed on North Korea, Cuba, Iraq, and now Iran and Venezuela. None of those governments have fallen, nor have there been any substantial changes in policies that the US did not like. Do targeted sanctions work any better? The idea of targeted or smart sanctions became increasingly popular in the late 1990s from the late 1990s on, after the devastating humanitarian costs of general sanctions on Iraq became clear. The EU, the UN, and various European and American NGOs push most strongly for sanctions that would be limited, humane, and effective. George Lopez and David Courtwright, who were among the key designers of these so-called smart sanctions, insist that they were are a vast improvement on comprehensive sanctions because they target the powerful and not the powerless. They argue and cite cases where they have been effective in ending violent conflicts, in preventing international terrorism, and in protecting human rights. They admit that targeted sanctions are much less effective at fulfilling one of the main purposes that they have tried to do, which is to limit the arms trade. Nonetheless, they insist that targeted sanctions do not have any significant wider humanitarian impact. They are, in short, useful and ethical. Joy Gordon, who has written extensively on sanctions, is much more skeptical. She argues that targeted sanctions are hard to implement and enforce, noting that joint US, EU, and UN efforts to embargo the export of arms to some countries have failed to curb legal and illegal arm trade or to shape the behavior of sanctioned countries. Targeted sanctions, she also argues, have consequences beyond their ostensible narrow target. A particular piece of machinery, a particular raw material, a particular product of one kind or another can have much wider impacts on the economy and the civilian population. She also notes that financial sanctions against individual leaders are not likely to change behavior. Although the powerful are definitely targeted, they seem immune to such pressures. In short, she argues smart sanctions are neither targeted nor humane nor effective. Secondary sanctions can get reluctant compliance from third country governments, but the latter tend to resent these violations on their sovereignty, and their businesses will seek to circumvent these secondary sanctions. Or you can get the current situation that we have with several European countries and the US vis-a-vis Iran. Governments can insist that secondary sanctions are illegitimate and they can try to work around them, as European countries have, but corporations and banks will nonetheless shun the sanctioned country out of fear of being shut out of US markets. Why don't sanctions work? I think there are several reasons. The theory behind general sanctions, or maximum pressure, to borrow the current favorite term, is that economies can be brought to the brink of collapse or even beyond, and the people will rise up against the regime, demanding effectively that it change its policies or even overthrowing it. If you look at the countries that have been subject to these comprehensive sanctions, that doesn't seem to have produced this result. Think about North Korea, Cuba, Iraq, or Iran. All these cases suggest that economies can be enormously disrupted and deprivation can be widespread, but the effects are usually to increase repression and authoritarian rule at home. And sometimes sanctions will rally the population behind the regime, and at the very least, it will lead many people to resent what they see as unjust outside punishment. Third countries, and this is an additional reason why sanctions don't work, third countries may allow their businesses to increase trade with and investment in the country sanctioned by the US. Profits are the main motive here. And interestingly, Brian Early has shown these countries are often US allies. The US, UAE, for example, for a long time allowed its countries to trade with Iran. Some third-party governments may offer foreign aid for political reasons. The Soviet Union support for Cuba is a key case in point. Here it is usually the ideological competitors of the US who have done this. Or you can get the current case you have with China, where China both engages in trade and aid with countries sanctioned by the US, Cuba and North Korea being the key cases. A third reason sanctions often are ineffective is that US businesses can get hurt by sanctions and they lobby for lifting them. Some firms may even move their headquarters outside of the US in order to circumvent the sanctions regime. Halliburton is one example. Those individual leaders who are sanctioned by the US in, say, Russia or China, that are prohibited from accessing funds in US banks, have probably already moved their money to one of the numerous safe havens on islands here or there that dot the globe and enable people to stash away large sums of money. And when the US proclaims travel bans, the governments which these leaders head can respond with travel bans of their own. Sanctions also can disrupt relationships with America's allies. This was certainly the case when the Trump administration imposed sanctions on key international criminal court judges. In a narrower way, it has disrupted the relationships between the US and Germany. And here the incident is not Iran, about which the Germans were angry, but the US threat to impose sanctions on German businesses who are involved in the completion of the Nord Stream 2 national gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. The pipeline is very controversial among Germans for environmental reasons, but no one likes this rather high-handed American effort to tell German business and the German government what it can and cannot do. So the final question I have is, if sanctions are not very effective, why do they continue to be used? Why does its number expand? The US now sanctions over 30, I think we're now getting close to 40 countries, from Venezuela and Cuba to Iran and Zimbabwe. The most recent sanctions have been imposed on Venezuela, Russia, and China. I think there are four main reasons. Sanctions are used because they are politically convenient and less costly to Americans than armed interventions. The government can claim to be doing something about bad behavior, real or imagined, but it stops short of war. Secondly, sanctions are invisible to most Americans who don't see the slow motion damage done to the health and living standards of civilians, the destruction of one economic sector after another in the sanctioned country. Sanctions are war at a distance in which no American lives are risked. In this, they are similar to the popular use of drones. Third, sanctions are a way for the US to simply express frustration, to signal it disapproves of something, and then to punish a country, even if it does not have much hope that it will change their policies. Sanctions substitute punishment for policy or diplomacy. Fourth, sanctions can mobilize domestic support for pressuring other governments and for demonizing them. They may start out being billed as an alternative to war, but can help get people to accept military action if the government decides it is necessary. That is what makes the current US empire of sanctions so dangerous. Thank you.